In this part 6 on my series to power, we will look at the role that sexuality, masculinity and femininity play in terms of power. There's a good deal of discourse that goes on in both the academic but also social media spheres that center around gender and sexuality. But in general, what I will try and do here is talk much more towards sexuality as its purpose relates to power, and what we can then glean from understanding how masculine, how feminine, the interaction thereof, but also by itself and how that affects us. So to do this, I've taken a lot of inspiration, you might call it, from a philosopher named Otto Weininger. He was a early 20th century philosopher from Austria who killed himself at about 21 after he wrote this treatise called Sex and Character, and in it he does go at length into the differences between men and women and what the resultant outcomes are, both from a social perspective but also a sexual biological perspective. It's quite a intriguing and interesting book, and I think Wittgenstein himself was quite enamored with Weininger's style, as well as many others who have encountered his work on this. It's very singular in the way that he writes, and I can recommend it highly. To start though, before I delve into that, it's best maybe to go into what Spengler has written about women, and there's a lot of text as you can see on the screen here, so a lot of this video might be spent reading, but I think it's very appropriate to harness the knowledge and ideas left to us in posterity from these great thinkers. So Spengler starts with, "And so woman despises that other history, man's politics, which she never comprehends, and of which all that she sees is that it takes her sons from her. What for her is a triumphant battle that annihilates the victories of 1,000 childbeds. Man's history sacrifices woman's history to itself, and no doubt there is a female heroism too, that proudly brings the sons to the sacrifice. Katrina Sforza on the walls of Imola. But nevertheless, there was, and is, and ever will be, a secret politic of the woman, of the female of the animal world even, that seeks to draw away her male from his kind and of his history, and to weave him body and soul into her own plant-like history of generic succession, that is, into herself. And yet, all that is accomplished in the man history is accomplished under the battle cries of hearth and home, wives and children, race and the like, and its very object is the covering and upholding of this history of birth and death. The conflict of man and man is ever on account of the blood of woman. Woman, as time, is that for which there is history for all... Woman as time is that for which there is history at all. The woman with race in her feels this even when she does not know it. She is destiny, she plays destiny. The play begins with the fight of men for the possession of her, Helen, and the tragedy of Carmen, and Catherine II, and the story of Napoleon and Desiree Clary, who in the end took Bernadotte over to the side of his enemies. And it is not a human play only, for this fight begins down in the animal world and fills the history of the whole species. And it culminates in her swaying, as mother or wife or mistress, the destiny of empires. Halgerd in the Njal saga, the Frankish queen Brunhilde, Marozia, who gave the Holy See to men of her choice. The man climbs up in his history until he has the fortune of a country in his hands, and then woman comes and forces him to his knees. People and states may go down in ruin over it, but she, in her history, has conquered. This, in the last analysis, is always the aim of the political ambition in a woman of race. Thus, history has two meanings, neither to be blasphemed. It is cosmic or politic. It is being, or it preserves being. There are two sorts of destiny, two sorts of war, two sorts of tragedy, public and private. Nothing can eliminate the duality from the world. It is radical, founded in the essence of the animal that is both microcosm and participant in the cosmic. It appears at all significant conjunctures in the form of a conflict of duties, which exists only for the man, not for the woman, and in the course of a higher culture it is never overcome, but only deepened. There are public life and private life, public law and private law, communal cults and domestic cults. As a state, being is in form for the one history. As race, breed, it is in flow as itself the other history. This is the old German distinction between the sword side and the spindle side of blood relationships. The double significance of directional time finds its higher expression in the ideas of the state and the family. And so here Spengler really gets to the nut of it in terms of describing exactly how the interrelationship of man and woman can be centered around the type of power that I'm trying to talk about and express here, and how we understand that the women is intertwined with both the rise and the fall, and that she has her own destiny. And when Spengler talks about female destiny and he says that women are destiny, and what he means by that is that women give birth, and so in doing they perform their you always call it heavenly but transcendent function. So as a woman, to give birth to a new generation is already a legacy. You get to own basically what is another generation's worth of you, your name, your blood. For men though, there's a different relationship to parenthood, and the ability to grow children is not inherent to men, and thus there's an inability to associate fatherhood in the same way that we associate motherhood. So the power that we derive therefrom is an archetype, and one of the archetypes for women, so you normally have seeresses or witches, and then you would have maidens, as he says, Helen of Troy, but then the last one is always mothers or grandmothers. And this archetype is not correspondent to a male or masculine archetype. It is truly female in its uniqueness, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to a male in the same way that a maiden and a knight would, and a seeress and a witch and a young adventurer, a questor would, because the relationship is not symbiotic. Mothers are almost a unity into and unto themselves. And this is what Spengler goes into in his discourses on this in Decline of the West, and how we can start to think about what femininity means separate to being a woman, and that Otto Weininger here is much more concerned with femininity and masculinity and the gender differences, but also the sexuality spectrum. And this is not the modern understanding of sexuality as a spectrum of all these weird typologies, but it's much more around from very masculine, and we say complete masculinity, to complete femininity. We all reside along somewhere on that spectrum, and that the nature of us as humans is that we have, as Weininger goes on to say, the same type of biological, you can call them auxiliary or antecedents, so things like nipples on men and the clitoris in women, and how the sexual dimorphism occurs quite early in the gestation period of the embryo, so that we understand that there's a smaller separation between the genders, but there's a larger separation between individual masculinity and femininity, and a lot of accounts of people who are good fits, and this is how his equation here comes up to it, whereby he sought to almost mathematically derive the function of attraction between men and women, but masculinity and femininity, and this is his attempt here from the book. And I'll go into maybe just a quick quote here where he starts to delve into much more thoughtful prose on power. They say the power of giving form to chaos is with those in whom the most universal memory has made the widest comprehension possible. It is a quality of the masculine genius. And you'll discover, if you read Sex and Character, that he has a very strong opinion to the, you might call it, preponderance or the well-established purposefulness of men versus the passivity and inherent meekness that is attributed to women. And then he attributes what he calls genius something that he recognized in Goethe, and Goethe's ability to say that geniuses only recognize genius, and that Wagner was quoted as saying art is discernible in itself. That he more or less attributes a inability to women to achieve this genius, and then when he talks about genius, it is related to his masculine idea of genius, which is this creative force that can only be possessed in the masculine. Now, we're remembering that this doesn't mean necessarily men, but it means that the creative force and that the power we derive is a masculine power, and that's how he discusses it. He also goes into something he calls Hennids, which is this half-formed thought, and that a lot of the creative power that we have stems from Hennids and trying to discover the full truth of our thoughts, and that we can then, in a masculine way, derive a purposefulness, a praxeological understanding of our existence to finding out the truth, and that the feminine side is less concerned and less obliged inherently to find truth and find it necessary. There's no compulsion, there's no will to truth, and this is how he demonstrates the differences in a feminine and a masculine arena. I think it's good to maybe show the rest of how he discusses it. And here he goes on to say, the great politician or ruler, and especially the despot, who rule ends with his death, seeks to increase his own value by making it independent of time. He may attempt it through a code of laws, or a biography like that of Julius Caesar, by some great philosophical undertaking, by the founding of museums or collections, or, and this is perhaps the favourite way, by alterations of the calendar. And he seeks to extend his power to the utmost during his lifetime, to preserve it, to make stable by enduring contacts and diplomatic marriages, and most of all by attacking and removing everything that could endanger the permanence of his kingdom. And so the politician becomes a conqueror. The common definition of value, that is in proportion to the power of the thing valued to relieve our wants, is quite incomplete without the element of time. Such things as air and water have no value only insofar as they are not localized and individualized, but as soon as they have been localized and individualized, and so receive form, they have received a quality that may not last, and with the idea of duration comes the idea of value. Form and timelessness, or individuation and duration, are the two factors which compose value. Thus it can be shown that the fundamental law of the theory of value applies both to individual psychology and to social psychology. The first general conclusion to be made is that the desire for timelessness, a craving for value, pervades all spheres of human activity, and this desire for real value, which is deeply bound up with the desire for power, is completely absent in the woman. And so Weininger here obviously being quite intent on this idea that we do have a stimuli and an anima that is required to satisfy itself, and the understanding of time, and this is perhaps a very Faustian theory, you might say, a thesis, in that the Faustian conception of time is related directly to our purposeful and extant will to power to the infinite. So we have this historical understanding that other cultures, other great cultures, have never had, because of our appreciation for time and the ability to invest in things with what we've created and called an internal rate of return, but a net present value. The thought of net present value has been absent both from a mathematical and economic point of view, but from a philosophical point of view for the rest of humanity. There was not this abstraction and then algebraic formulation of a net present value with a discount rate. This idea that we've associated a loss in utility over time is very Faustian, and so his understanding is obviously informed exactly by that. I think it's also good to go on to say a little bit more about how the interaction of feminine and masculine are symbiotic, but they do coexist, and that we necessarily, and this is where you need to reflect on yourself to say, how masculine and how feminine am I? And you need to properly step outside of yourself in a way that you can analyze all of your traits in the way that you are in your own morphological form, to say, and this is the, you might call it, tyro or rookie error, which is, if you're a dilettante perhaps, then you would go and say, I'm very masculine, look how manly I am, I do everything like a man, of course I'm 100%. But the idea is that you reflect on every situation you've been in, and whether your response to every type of interaction or action is a masculine one, and what your likes and dislikes are, and how that reflects upon you in a masculine or feminine way. And you can start to construct these conceptual morphological forms of people as how they are dispersed among their, or the percentage split of masculine and feminine. And Weininger himself identifies our best pairing is with someone who's the opposite proportion. So if I'm 90% masculine, then I'm best off with a woman who's 10% masculine and 90% feminine. And that would, of course, naturally provide what would be a appropriate or perfect match. And how well you can do that in reality is obviously not as mathematically pleasing as Weininger was hoping for, but I think it's worth talking about, and that there are no kings without queens. It is this continual and eternal concern that a man who's striven for power and wealth, and this is the duality between if you're a Viking or a knight, and there's some form of you that's extrinsic driving you towards this, I need to be a powerful man or I need to be a rich man, then the reward and commensurate to your position and your ability to achieve said goals is a woman, and not vice versa. So for women who are successful, there is not a corresponding man that is won at the end of this journey. It's not what their power, or at least their aspiration for power, involves. Theirs relates directly to men, and as Spengler said before, and I quoted on, their exact interaction with men is to be both a destiny but also harness what the man has done and then win him. So in a sense, they've conquered more than just the kingdom, they've conquered the man who conquered the kingdom. And this is why Helen of Troy is such a powerful figure, because she was able to have 1,000 ships launched in her name. There are very few men who could command such requisite response, particularly from an army. The next part I can start is another quote here from Spengler, and he goes on to say, hence women, as more instinctive and nearer to the cosmic rhythms, adapt themselves more readily than men to the forms of a new milieu. Women from the bottom strata move in elegant society with entire certainty after a few years, and sink again as quickly. But men alter slowly, because they are more awake and aware. The proletarian man never becomes wholly an aristocrat, the aristocrat never wholly a proletarian. Only in the sons does the beat of the new milieu make its appearance, which speaks into the feminine ability to adapt, and that an adaptation is necessarily feminine in the way that you're no longer imposing what is your concrete and inviolable will, and such that you are mutable, then you are in a corresponding way more feminine, and that might lead you to more success. And being adaptable can, in some social circles and circumstances, be very beneficial. There can be a huge interrelationship to winning and being adaptive, but it is a feminine trait. And so if you have these men who are extremely adaptive, and you would almost call it and as Weininger says, to the extent that the homosexual men portray themselves as being women and can be better women than the women can, you're obviously seeing what is an extreme feminization of extreme feminine version of any type of characteristic you might have. And this is where that really insightful and elucidating instruction Weininger has comes into play, in that it completely shifts the way you start to perceive people in general and how they act. And once you can calculate the disposition or the deportment of someone and how they're more feminine or less feminine, more masculine, less masculine, your situational awareness, but also your ability to deal with them in social circumstances, is improved. And if you're very masculine, it's going to be very difficult for you to not butt heads with other very masculine men. It is in our nature to do so, to determine the hierarchical place and the status we have. And that, as I said before, Canis Canem Edit is the dog-eat-dog for men, whereas the women have a much better time at intrinsically knowing how and when to respond to things. And this is where we get that stereotype around women being much better at social situations, but also interacting with other people, and why a lot of very core careers around dealing with people are inundated with women, versus whether we'd have a dearth of men as, say, nurses or hairdressers or any type of interactive activity, versus something which is much more isolated in solitude, such as mathematics or engineering, because it just speaks naturally to us on that scale of masculine to feminine. It might be worth finalizing here with a excerpt from King Lear by Shakespeare, because obviously I felt it necessary to define a subject which Shakespeare understood as he understood almost every subject in that way of his own genius. But in King Lear, Albany goes on to say, "O Goneril, you are not worth the dust which the rude wind blows in your face. I fear your disposition, that nature which contends its origins, cannot be boarded, certain in itself. She that herself will sliver and disbranch from her material sap, perforce must wither and come to deadly use." And in that is to say that when we step away from who we are as this feminine and masculine idea, and that we must push ourselves into realms where we're not a perfect match to the circumstances required from us, is when we start to feel outside of ourselves. And this is what can allow people to not necessarily thrive. And that if you are in this pursuit of power, you have to understand how desirous it is and necessary to be the most masculine version of yourself. It can be altered and adjusted, but it needs to be a ardent focus of you and how you react to situations. That if you are interested in being powerful, then every and all kings and tyrants have been the most masculine. This bears out not necessarily in positive traits, but it's to say that the admission is, from a personal and character point of view, that you must win. It is this death or dishonor. You must be willing to sacrifice it all. And once again comes back to the Allfather, to Odin, and how he was willing to sacrifice all of it to be successful. And that's the masculine power, as opposed to the feminine power, which is this much softer and you could say opaque idea, related much more towards acting in accordance with nature, and that men are a violation of this nature. And that's where that power instrument is born out of, this will against the world, versus an adaptive, flowing and receptive way that women are able to conjure themselves, and their power can be seen through the way that they are both interacting with men, but also as mothers, and then sometimes as seeresses or witches.